The first timber went up in late August, a dark line drawn against a pale, sun-bleached sky. Down in the valley, the other settlers of Prairie Creek were mending fences or putting up the last of the hay, their movements dictated by the familiar rhythms of the coming autumn. But on the low rise at the edge of the settlement, the lone figure of Agnes worked to a different rhythm entirely. She was building upwards, not outwards. The foundation was already there, a sturdy, well-made barn her late husband had raised with his own hands years before. It was a good barn, with thick walls and a strong roof. But Agnes was adding to it, creating something no one there had ever seen. She was building her house on top of her barn. From the porch of the general store, it was the primary topic of conversation, a welcome diversion from the price of seed and the threat of drought. They watched her through a spy scope Mr. Henderson kept for tracking distant cattle, a tiny figure wrestling with beams and planks. "It's unnatural," muttered Franklin Davies, a man whose opinions were as expansive as his land holdings. He lowered the scope and passed it to his neighbor. "A house belongs on the earth. Solid ground. What is she thinking, perching up there like a chicken in a tree?" The men around him chuckled, a low rumble of agreement. The ridicule was not loud or cruel, not to her face, at least. It was a kind of communal head-shaking, a shared certainty that the widow had finally been broken by grief and loneliness. They called it the folly. Saw Agnes's perch. The women were a little kinder, their pity mixed with unease. "Poor thing," said Mrs. Gable, her hands busy sorting beans. "To lose a husband and then your senses right after. She'll freeze to death in that hayloft come January." Her words were a prophecy spoken with the casual authority of common sense. The logic was simple: heat rises, but cold sinks. A house raised into the wind, with nothing but open air beneath it, would be impossible to keep warm. It was a violation of the basic principles of survival they all lived by. Agnes, of course, heard the whispers. She saw the way they stopped talking when she entered the store, the pitying glances that followed her down the dusty track. She bought her nails and her salt, said little, and returned to her work, her silence mistaken for delusion. They saw a woman building a mistake. They couldn't see the memory she was building from, a picture of a stone barn in a cold, far-off land, a place where farmers understood that the most reliable furnace was a living one. They saw foolishness, but Agnes was laying the floorboards of her salvation, guided by a wisdom they had long forgotten. Her work was slow and methodical, a conversation between muscle, wood, and memory. Each morning, before the sun had burned the chill from the air, she was out there. Her tools were not new, but they were sharp and well-oiled, extensions of her own hands. She used a simple block and tackle, a system of ropes and wheels her husband had left her, to hoist the heavy beams into place. It was a painstaking process. The rope would creak and groan under the strain, the beam rising inch by agonizing inch, swinging gently in the breeze until she could guide it into its notch. The men in the valley, who could raise a wall in an afternoon with 4 pairs of hands, saw her struggle as proof of her folly. They didn't see the efficiency in her movements, the lack of any wasted energy. They didn't understand that her solitude had taught her patience, how to use leverage and balance to make the work of 4 men the work of one. She was not strong in the way a man was strong, with explosive power, but she possessed an endurance that was far more formidable. It was the endurance of the seasons themselves, a quiet, relentless force. As she worked, her mind often drifted back to her grandfather's stories. He'd been a farmer in a land of cold mountains and deep snows, a place where winter was not a visitor but a ruler. He spoke of barns built into hillsides, with the family's living quarters built over the animal stalls. "The beasts are our second fire," he would say, his voice thick with an accent that had faded from her own tongue. "God gives them life, and their life gives us warmth. You don't waste a gift like that." He described the gentle, constant heat that would rise through the thick wooden floors, a warmth that owed nothing to a woodpile. It was a deep, radiant heat that kept the chill from the bones, that made the harsh winter nights bearable. In this new land, with its abundance of timber, the settlers had forgotten such frugality. They built sprawling houses with massive stone fireplaces, measuring a man's wealth by the size of his woodpile. They fought the cold with brute force, with roaring fires that consumed forests. Agnes was choosing a different way, an older way. She was building a shelter that didn't fight the winter but instead made an alliance with the quiet, persistent heat of life itself. Her neighbors saw her small, slowly growing woodpile and saw only carelessness. They couldn't know she was building a home that would barely need it. The structure took shape with a logic all its own. The floor of her small cabin was the ceiling of the barn, but it was constructed with unusual care. She laid 2 layers of thick planks, staggering the seams to minimize drafts. But unlike a normal floor, she didn't seal every crack with pitch. Instead, she left tiny, almost imperceptible gaps between certain boards, a pattern that seemed random to any observer but was, in fact, a carefully designed system of passive ventilation. These were not mistakes, they were pores, designed to let the warm, moist air from the barn below breathe gently into the room above. The cabin itself was small, just one room, with a low, angled ceiling to keep the warm air from collecting uselessly high above her head. She built a small, cast-iron stove in one corner, its pipe going straight up through the roof. It was a cooking stove, efficient and small, meant for heating a pot of stew, not a house. When Mr. Davies rode by one afternoon and saw it, he couldn't help but call out, his voice laced with a condescending sort of kindness. "Agnes, that little thing? It won't keep a child's hands warm in a norther. You need a real hearth, a proper fireplace." Agnes simply looked up from her work, shielding her eyes from the sun. "It will be enough," she said, and that was all. Her certainty was infuriating. It flew in the face of everything they knew. Below, in the barn, she was just as meticulous. She reinforced the stalls, laid down deep beds of fresh, dry straw. She cleaned and repaired the troughs. The space was being prepared not just for animals, but as the engine room of her winter survival. The comfort of her 2 cows and half-dozen sheep was paramount. Their well-being was her own. October brought a new crispness to the air. The leaves of the aspens in the creek bed turned a brilliant, trembling gold, then fell, leaving skeletal branches against the deepening blue of the sky. The nights grew teeth. In the homes of Prairie Creek, the evening ritual began. Fires were lit in the great stone hearths, their hungry flames devouring the seasoned logs stacked high on the porches. The smell of wood smoke became a permanent part of the twilight air, a comforting blanket against the encroaching cold. At the Davies Ranch, the fireplace was enormous, a monument of river stone that could take a log the size of a man's thigh. It was a constant battle. The fire threw off tremendous heat, making the area directly in front of it almost unbearably hot, while the far corners of the large room remained stubbornly, draftily cold. The chore of feeding it was relentless, hauling in the heavy logs, stoking the embers, cleaning out the ash. The fire was a demanding, insatiable beast. At Agnes's place, the routine was different. As dusk fell, she would lead her animals into the barn. The 2 cows, their breath misting in the cool air, would settle into their stalls with a soft lowing. The sheep would huddle together, their woolly bodies a living blanket. After checking their water and feed, she would slide the heavy barn door shut, the sound a final, solid note against the evening's quiet. Upstairs, in her nearly completed cabin, the change was subtle but undeniable. The floorboards, which had been cool to the touch all day, began to lose their chill. A faint, almost imperceptible warmth began to rise from below. It wasn't the scorching heat of a fire, it was a gentle, pervasive warmth, the kind that seeps into your bones. She would light her small stove, but only for an hour or so, to boil water for tea and heat her supper. The little fire would die down to embers, but the room would remain comfortable, a pocket of calm defiance against the growing cold of the world outside. The first snow came early that year, a light dusting that melted by noon but left a promise of what was to come. The talk in the settlement turned more serious. The old-timers looked at the sky, at the way the squirrels were hoarding nuts with a frantic energy, and predicted a hard winter. The mockery of Agnes's perch began to be tinged with a grim sort of pity. It was one thing to laugh at a woman's strange project in the warm sun of September, it was another to imagine her up there when the blizzards came howling down from the mountains. Mrs. Gable, who considered herself the arbiter of community charity, organized a collection. Not of money, but of firewood. Several men brought over a small cart loaded with split logs and stacked them near Agnes's door. It was a public act of kindness that was also a public declaration of her foolishness. They were certain she would need it, that her pride would break when the real cold set in. Franklin Davies made a point of delivering the last load himself. "Now, Agnes," he said, his tone that of a father speaking to a wayward child. "There's no shame in admitting a mistake. You take this wood. When the time comes, you'll be grateful for it." Agnes looked at the pile of wood, then at his earnest, patronizing face. "Thank you, Franklin," she said, her voice even. "Your concern is noted." She did not refuse the gift, but she didn't show the effusive gratitude he expected, either. She simply went back inside, leaving him standing there feeling both charitable and strangely rebuffed. Her quiet refusal to be saved was the most galling part of her madness. She was acting as if she knew something they didn't, and for the life of them, they couldn't imagine what it could be. The blizzard arrived not with a whisper but a roar. It began in the dead of night, a rising scream of wind that rattled the window frames and drove a fine powder of snow through the tiniest cracks in the walls. By dawn, the world was gone, erased by a churning, blinding wall of white. The temperature plummeted, and the wind, a relentless, physical force, scoured the landscape. This was no mere snowstorm, it was a siege. All across the valley, families huddled in their homes, suddenly prisoners. The main task of survival became the feeding of the fire. The wind seemed to suck the heat right out of the houses, and the fires that had once seemed so mighty now fought a desperate, losing battle against the invasive cold. In the Davies home, a thick blanket was hung over the main doorway to block the drafts. Mrs. Davies and her children stayed close to the hearth, wrapped in every quilt they owned, yet still they shivered. Mr. Davies made perilous trips to the woodshed, returning each time coated in snow, his face raw, his beard frozen solid. The woodpile, which had looked so immense just a day before, was shrinking at a terrifying rate. He began to ration the logs, his earlier confidence replaced by a gnawing anxiety. The fire, their sole defense, was a hungry god demanding constant sacrifice, and their offerings were running out. Above it all, on its exposed rise, Agnes's cabin endured the full, unbroken force of the storm. The wind hammered at the small structure, a physical assault that made the timbers groan. Snow piled in deep, sculpted drifts against the walls. From the outside, it looked like the most vulnerable place in the entire valley, a tiny ship in a frozen hurricane. Inside, there was a profound and startling peace. The howling of the wind was a distant thing, a rage that could not penetrate the small, warm space. The cabin was not hot, but it was a universe away from the life-stealing cold outside. The source of this impossible comfort was the floor. It radiated a steady, gentle warmth, a constant and reliable presence. It was the warmth of living breath, of blood moving through veins, of digestion and the slow, quiet work of life itself. The collective body heat of the cows and sheep in the sealed barn below rose steadily, turning the entire floor into a single, massive, low-temperature heating element. Agnes sat in her rocking chair, mending a wool sock by the light of a single oil lamp. The flame burned straight and tall, undisturbed by drafts. She had cooked a small meal of beans and salted pork earlier, and the little stove was now cold. She didn't need it. She could hear, faintly, the soft movements of the animals below her feet, a cow shifting its weight, the rustle of hay. They were calm and safe, and so was she. The blizzard was not a threat to be fought, but a storm to be waited out. Her system, born of an old and quiet wisdom, was working. The snow that piled up on her roof was not a crushing weight but a blanket of insulation, further sealing her in her pocket of warmth. While her neighbors burned through their winter's labor log by log, she sat in the heart of the storm, sustained by the simple, miraculous heat of a few sleeping animals. On the third day of the blizzard, the crisis came to the Gable house. They were not as well prepared as the Davies family. Their wood was a mix of seasoned and green logs, and the green one sputtered and refused to burn properly in the cold sap chimney. By morning, their fire was little more than a pile of smoking, hissing embers. The cold in their small cabin was now a physical presence, a painful, creeping thing that stole the breath and numbed the limbs. Their two young children were huddled under a pile of blankets, their faces pale and their lips tinged with blue. Desperate, Mr. Gable fought his way through the chest-deep snow to the Davies ranch, hoping for help. He found a grim and rationed welcome. Franklin Davies gave him a few logs, all he felt he could spare, and a stark warning. "We're burning through it too fast," he shouted over the wind. "This keeps up for 2 more days, and we'll all be in trouble." The defeated Gable started back, the few logs a pathetic offering against the monumental cold. And then, through the swirling chaos of snow, he saw it, a light. It was a faint, steady yellow glow from the window of Agnes's perch. It seemed impossible. Every other home was either dark or flickering with the frantic light of a struggling fire. That high, steady light was a beacon of calm defiance. With no other hope left, he changed direction, pushing his way toward the folly on the hill. He hammered on the big barn door, his numb hand barely able to make a fist, shouting her name into the wind, expecting to find her frozen, the light a forgotten lamp burning beside her body. The big door groaned open, and a wave of warm, animal-scented air washed over him. The shock of it was staggering. It was like stepping into a different world. The wind's roar was instantly muffled, replaced by the gentle sounds of contented livestock. He stared, uncomprehending, at the 2 cows placidly chewing their cud in the lantern light, their bodies radiating a visible aura of heat. Agnes stood there, holding the lantern, her face calm. "Mr. Gable," she said, her voice even. "You are in distress." He could only stammer, his words lost in shivering gasps. She led him up the sturdy ladder to the trapdoor that opened into her cabin. The moment he pushed his head and shoulders into the room above, he stopped, stunned into silence. The warmth was absolute. It was a soft, enveloping heat that seemed to rise from the very floorboards. He looked around the small, tidy room. He saw the cold stove, the single lamp, the woman in her simple dress and shawl, looking at him with an expression that held no triumph, only a quiet, waiting compassion. "How?" he finally whispered, looking from the floor to her face. "The fire. Where is the fire?" She gestured to the floor with her hand. "The fire is below us," she said simply. "The living heat. It rises." It was an explanation so simple, so elemental, that it took his breath away. It was not magic. It was a law of nature she had understood and harnessed. He thought of his own family, shivering in their icy home, and shame washed over him, hot and sharp. He had mocked this woman. He had pitied her. And she had been wiser than them all. Without another word, she was already putting on her heavy coat, ready to help him bring his family to safety. The story of the Gables' rescue spread through Prairie Creek as soon as the blizzard broke and people could move again. It traveled faster than gossip, taking on the weight of legend. At first, it was met with disbelief. A house heated by cows? It sounded like a child's fancy. But then people went to see for themselves. They came in 1s and 2s, their boots crunching on the newly packed snow, drawn by a curiosity that had replaced their scorn. They stood awkwardly in her barn, feeling the impossible warmth, their skepticism melting away in the gentle heat. They climbed the ladder and stepped onto her floor, their bare hands feeling the proof that their own senses could not deny. They saw her tiny stove and her nearly untouched stack of gift wood, and they finally understood. Franklin Davies was one of the last to visit. He came alone, his hat in his hands, his usual bluster gone. He did not say much. He walked the perimeter of the small cabin, touched the walls, and stood for a long time over the warmest part of the floor, directly above where the cows were stalled. He looked at Agnes, and for the first time, he saw not a foolish widow, but a woman of profound and practical intelligence. "I owe you an apology, Agnes," he said, his voice low and heavy with sincerity. "We all do. We thought you were losing your senses, but you were the only one thinking clearly." Agnes simply nodded, accepting the words without ceremony. There was no need for anything more. The proof was all around them, in the warm air, the solid timbers, and the quiet, enduring peace of the place she had built. The silent judgment of the community had finally, irrevocably, been reversed. The winter that followed was as harsh as the old-timers had predicted, but for Agnes, it was the most comfortable she had ever spent. While her neighbors constantly worried over their dwindling woodpiles, her primary concern was ensuring her animals had enough hay. Her folly had become her fortress, a haven of warmth and security that demanded almost nothing from her. The name for her home changed, too. No one called it the perch or the folly anymore. They started calling it the loft house or the warm barn, the name spoken with a new tone of admiration and respect. The idea, so alien just a few months before, began to seem like simple, unassailable wisdom. Young couples planning to build new homesteads would come to speak with her, not out of pity, but for advice. They brought notebooks and took measurements, asking questions about the thickness of the floor, the placement of the stalls, the way she managed the ventilation. She answered their questions patiently, sharing the knowledge her grandfather had given her, passing on the legacy of the living fire. The following summer, a new barn began to rise in the western part of the valley. It was much larger than Agnes's, but the design was unmistakable. On top of the sturdy lower structure, the framework for a small, compact living space was being built. From her own hill, Agnes could see the shape of it, a dark frame against the green fields. It was a mirror of her own home, a testament to an idea that had taken root. She had not sought to teach or to lead. She had simply sought to survive, using the knowledge she had. In doing so, she had reminded her community of a fundamental truth, that the most powerful solutions are often the quietest, and that true wisdom is not about fighting the world, but about understanding its rhythms and living in harmony with them. Her legacy was not carved in stone or written in a book, it was being raised in timber, a warm floor for a cold country.